The Strike Eagle pilot who was shot down over Iran in April now says he saw a jellyfish-like drone swarm, or maybe even a flying drone minefield operating in Iranian airspace right before his fighter was hit by a surface-to-air missile. Now, this report has already seen its fair share of criticism, in part because it didn't come from the pilot himself, but rather from anonymous sources who claim to have knowledge of the matter when speaking to CNN. But also because the pilot in question was pretty obviously under an incredible amount of stress during this incident. Not only did this pilot reportedly suffer a concussion during his ejection, but as we discussed just a few weeks ago, this wasn't even the first time this poor guy had been shot down. In fact, this was the second time he was forced to eject over the span of only about 5 weeks. The same pilot behind this new jellyfish drone report was also shot down at the onset of Operation Epic Fury, along with 2 of his wingmen, in a friendly fire incident involving a Kuwaiti F-18 Hornet. But punching out of 2 exploding Strike Eagles in less time than it takes to complete Air Force basic training notwithstanding, I think it's entirely possible that this pilot really did see something out of the ordinary while flying combat operations over Iran. And while I can't tell you what he saw conclusively, I do have some ideas. So, let's talk about reports of a jellyfish-like drone swarm operating over Iran during Operation Epic Fury, the potential explanations for the pilot's account, and which one I'd put my money on if I were a betting man. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Ground news helps you stay on top of what's going on in the world, while it also helps you see right through common forms of media bias and all the sensationalism that's run so rampant these days. Ground news pulls this off by compiling stories from news outlets all over the planet and then putting them all into one easy-to-read feed, making it easier than ever to not just stay on top of the news trends, but also to see the differences in how stories are presented and how they're covered. Like this one, about Google's threat intelligence group identifying a year-long Chinese espionage effort to infiltrate North American medical and research institutions. Ground News has already gathered coverage of this story from 22 different news outlets, with at least 6 of them currently rated as centrist. And here on the right side of the screen, we can see the bias distribution and factuality ratings for the coverage of this story, with about 60% of the outlets covering it listed as politically centered, and 90% of those outlets rated for high factuality. And Ground News also shows you really important stuff about the news outlets along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or any government affiliations. And you guys know me, I love the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me news stories that are getting lots of attention in one political arena but are being ignored in the other. It helps me make sure I'm keeping my media intake balanced. Ground News is a big part of my day-to-day news consumption and my research process, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or you guys know the deal. Follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that will help you stay on top of things. On April 3rd, 2026, a U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle flying under the call sign Dude 44 was shot down by Iranian forces in the foothills of the Dina subrange of the Zagros Mountains that span Iran from its northwest border all the way southeast toward the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this 150-mile-wide strip of mountainous terrain could arguably be compared to the remote backcountry of the southern Rockies or the high desert ranges of Nevada. It's a rugged, unforgiving, and sparsely populated expanse of arduous terrain with lots of deep-cut and narrow valleys that are perfect for hiding dispersed military capabilities like, say, ballistic missile and drone launchers, short-range surface-to-air missile systems, and more. At that point in Operation Epic Fury, the US had already struck more than 13,000 individual targets, many in Iran's southwest, while Israeli forces primarily operated further north. And since then, credible reports have surfaced showing that despite significant tactical losses all across Iran, the nation's strategy of distributing and hiding its military arsenal was pretty darn effective, with only about 30% of Iran's road-mobile missile launchers and Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles said to be destroyed by American and Israeli strikes. And while the U.S. Air Force has yet to disclose the mission being flown by Dude 44 prior to being shot down, it seems pretty likely that that air-to-ground focused fighter and its crew were scouring the Iranian terrain for those very hidden systems. That would, after all, explain why the aircraft was flying low enough in the first place to be engaged by a man-pad, or man-portable air defense system, which is reportedly how the aircraft was shot down. Now, we've discussed Iran's man-pads in a bunch of previous videos, and we've talked about the Chinese man-pads that are believed to have actually been used in this specific engagement. But all we really need to know for the sake of this conversation is that all of them have operational ceilings that are well below 15,000 feet. Now, the Strike Eagle has a reported service ceiling of a whopping 60,000 feet, which is higher than, well, most of its modern peers, and it leaves plenty of room to fly in contested airspace without running the risk of eating one of those short-range infrared-guided missiles launched by somebody's shoulder-mounted tube. And our pilot, who again had already been shot down 5 weeks earlier, was pretty unlikely to be flying that low for no reason. Now, according to CNN's reporting, just before being hit by that shoulder-fired missile and punching out, the Strike Eagle pilot described seeing multiple drones hovering in the air, moving in unison in a formation that resembled a jellyfish. Now, one of the Force sources who spoke to CNN on the condition of anonymity described it as, quote, multiple drones interconnected and moving as one, with smaller drones below the bigger drones like legs, before going on to call it real alien. Now, another of those sources went on to describe what the pilot saw as, quote, a minefield of drones in the air. Of course, neither the pilot nor his weapons systems officer in the back seat, who has yet to confirm the pilot's report, had much time to take in the sights before having to eject from their aircraft. The pilot was rescued just about 7 hours later, though his WISO, or weapons systems officer, who was reportedly injured after his parachute didn't fully deploy, was forced to avoid Iranian search parties for more than 50 hours before ultimately being rescued by American special operators. And it was upon the pilot's return and subsequent debrief that he allegedly first relayed his unusual jellyfish drone formation sighting. And as I mentioned at the top, CNN claims this report spurred a firestorm of debate within the American intelligence apparatus that is still ongoing as we speak. Now, the first thing that we need to address in our own effort to figure out just what that pilot saw is actually the pilot himself. Now, as I mentioned, these reports didn't come directly from him, but were rather relayed to CNN by unnamed sources that claim to have knowledge of the matter. So, right off the bat, we've got to decide for ourselves if we're going to take CNN's reporting at face value, as so far, no other sources have come forward to corroborate their story. Now, for the sake of this conversation in today's video, we're going to do that because it wouldn't be very interesting for me to just say nuh-uh and end the video here. So, assuming the story is broadly true, the next thing we need to assess is whether or not the pilot's recounting of events can be trusted. Now, according to reports, the pilot did suffer a concussion during his ejection, and of course, he had already gone through being shot down and having to eject just a few weeks earlier. So, objectively, we're talking about an extremely stressful situation with head trauma thrown in for good measure. And to be honest, that concussion could really be salient here because of a symptom that is commonly tied to concussion and head trauma called retrograde amnesia. Now, in movies, amnesia is usually depicted as a person losing all of their memories, not even knowing who they are. But retrograde amnesia is specifically about the loss of or distortion of memories directly preceding head trauma. In other words, it isn't at all uncommon for people with concussions to misremember or not remember at all the events surrounding their concussion. And when people work to try to regain their memories of the incident, commonly called memory reconstruction, they also naturally tend to alter or modify those memories, which can lead to inaccuracies. And this, to be honest, is enough for some people to just dismiss these claims as the pilot just misremembering something that he saw in the split second before being hit by that missile, like a flock of birds or a group of Shahed-style kamikaze drones flying close to one another toward far-flung targets. And I want to be clear that suggesting that this is a possibility is not meant in any way to suggest that the pilot was lying or was so meek that a concussion could scramble his brains. I have had more than one concussion over the years, and my brains may be scrambled, but they still mostly function, and I'd be willing to bet his do too. Then, just like dismissing the story outright, chalking this report up to a pilot bonking his head and seeing stars is also, well, pretty lame for conversation's sake. So let's also assume that this report is entirely factual. After all, we were not there, and as I've said in videos in the past, I am not in the business of second-guessing a professional fighter pilot from the comfort of my office chair. So, if we take this story at face value, what type of drone systems might look like a jellyfish, with a larger drone seemingly guiding smaller drones in unison? And right off the bat, you need to know that there is a distinct, but not easy to see, difference between a drone swarm and a whole bunch of drones just flying in close quarters toward a target. As Thomas Newdick and Tyler Rogaway pointed out for the Warzone just recently, drone swarms are interconnected via data link and work cooperatively in real time to maximize their impact on the battlefield. And that is not the same as a big group of independent, unconnected drones all flying toward the same target at the same time, even though these two things might actually look the same to an outside observer. Now, Iran has invested heavily into drone programs in recent decades, with a long list of mostly fixed-wing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drones already in service. And of course, they've also got lots of one-way attack drones that are, if we're being honest, more like cheap cruise missiles than the quadcopters that people tend to imagine when they hear the word drone. But as far as public reports go, Iran does not have any systems capable of cooperatively swarming in the way our pilot described. So one possibility then could be an existing ISR drone, like Iran's Qad's Yasir, which is basically a reverse-engineered American Scan Eagle, or maybe the bigger Shahed 149 Gaza, which is pretty similar to America's MQ-9 Reaper, operating in conjunction with some off-the-shelf commercial quadcopters, all operated via an as-yet undisclosed drone autonomy suite. Of course, whatever that pilot saw doesn't really have to have been indigenous to Iran's technological sector, as both Russia and China are well known to be providing Iran with direct military support in exchange for oil through what the Atlantic Council has dubbed the axis of evasion, or covert supply chain networks that were designed specifically to skirt Western sanctions. And all the way back in 2021, Russian state media announced the nation's new Grom, or Thunder unmanned aerial vehicle, would be equipped to control a swarm of 10 smaller Molniya, or lightning drones, in strike and reconnaissance configurations. And while I'm obviously not one to take Russian state media claims at face value, a report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies published in April of this year also outlined how Russia does seem to have fielded fully autonomous and potentially even swarm-capable systems like the armed VTU, marking a pretty recent departure from Russia's remotely piloted expendable drone model. And likewise, according to the Institute for the Study of War, Russia began using Gerbera drones, touted as an even cheaper and more simplified version of the Garan 2, or Iran's Shahed 136, to ferry and deploy small FPV drones into the Ukrainian rear for attacks. Now, neither of these is a dead ringer for that jellyfish concept of one large drone with smaller drones operating in unison around it, but they are certainly steps toward that capability. China, on the other hand, actually already has a long list of developmental systems that really might be able to fit our pilot's description, at least if you squint at them the right way, including drone motherships like the Jijuan SS-UAV, which saw a CGI render making the rounds online about a year or so ago. China also claims that its FH-97 line of drones, which are more akin to American collaborative combat aircraft or drone wingmen, also boast full swarming capabilities. And it's important to note that those kinds of capabilities are not necessarily tied to the platforms or the hardware that leverages them. As long as the drone has a data link and a means of control, it could theoretically be tied into off-board autonomy software, meaning the swarming logic is not being computed on board the drone, but rather elsewhere, like in a larger drone or at a ground station. Now, that's all to say that it is certainly possible that Iranian forces were operating their own large and small drone combinations being controlled by foreign-sourced off-board autonomy suites, or they could have been operating a combination of swarming drone systems provided to them by Russia or, probably more likely, by China. But possible is not the same as likely. And if Iran did have these systems and capabilities, they would probably have been leveraged elsewhere in this fight other than in this one specific incident. And most importantly in this context, the jellyfish drone minefield described by the pilot doesn't seem to have had anything to do with the missile that actually brought the fighter down, prompting us to question what the drones were doing at all. It's possible that they were being used to cue the manpad operators to an inbound target. But again, manpads are short-range weapons that rely on line of sight. You don't really need a complex autonomous drone swarm to help you find a fighter in the sky for those purposes. Now, to be clear, that does not mean this weird drone sighting couldn't possibly have been Iranian, Russian, or Chinese. I'm just not at all convinced that it was any of them. And that means I'm going to need to keep searching for what I think is the most likely culprit. As we've already discussed, this jellyfish drone swarm was also described in CNN's report as, quote, multiple drones interconnected and moving as one, with smaller drones below the bigger drones like legs. And this is where you might want to put on your tinfoil hat, because that's actually uncomfortably close to the mystery drones people reported seeing over military bases in and around Langley, Virginia back in December of 2023. Just like Iran's jellyfish, those drone incursions were said to involve large fixed-wing drones flying in formation with small quadcopters. According to U.S. officials who spoke to the Wall Street Journal, the military does not believe those drones that flew over Langley were owned or operated by hobbyists. They were too big, and the formations they flew in were deemed to be too complex. The larger fixed-wing drones, witnesses reported, would fly as low as just 100 feet off the ground, while their quadcopter wingmen, said to be the size of standard 20-pound commercial drones, would accompany them just a few dozen feet below. Now, these drone formations primarily flew around, but they were also seen hovering in place in more than one instance. And the only thing we really know for sure is that the quadcopters that were flying with these drones were not operating on the same radio frequency bands that are available for commercial drones of that type. The military determined that. In fact, the closest thing to the jellyfish drone swarm that I've been able to turn up in my research also came from unexplained sightings in the United States, amid a rash of drone swarm sightings across the American heartland in 2019 and 2020. One account from a Kansas highway state trooper was released and subsequently published by the War Zone in July of 2020. I'm going to cite it directly. Quote, he said one of the drones had a really bright light on it, like a spotlight. That drone stayed relatively stationary at that location. He then said there were anywhere from 10 to 15 drones that flew all kinds of patterns around that stationary drone. At one point, one of those drones flew directly over his house. He had his night vision with him, so he tried to look at it. Some of the lights on the drone drowned out a good picture with the NVGs, but he said he thought he saw 4 rotors on the drone, as well as a horizontal stabilizer or wing. Now, the wing appeared to be about 10 feet in length. He said the drone was about 200 feet in the air and made absolutely no sound at all, even though the wind was calm. And that kind of sounds like a jellyfish drone formation, doesn't it? Other reports from the same region of the country at around the same time described the drones as flying in a coordinated grid pattern over rural areas late at night, something that might look similar to a flying drone minefield. Now, there are lots of reasons for drones to coordinate in that sort of manner. Hypothetically, drones armed with explosives could loiter over a defended area while taking their cues from the larger sensor-bearing aircraft so they can close with any inbound fighters or bombers like the flying drone minefield that the pilot described. But this is something that's never actually been demonstrated, at least as far as we know, and importantly, the drones did not seem to have played a direct role in downing that jet. But another reason that you might see drones operating in this manner is to not only help the smaller drones cover greater distances, but also to extend the sensor reach of that larger drone at the center of the formation, using the larger craft to manage the swarm while serving as a communications node, a sensor relay, and maybe even a navigation anchor in GPS-denied environments. Small quadcopter drones tend to have maximum ranges of well under 30 miles, but if they're carried and deployed by a larger drone, they can cover great distances before being activated. And this all brings us around to my final theory regarding this unusual sighting, which, again, assuming the report is accurate and the pilot really did see a drone jellyfish formation, seems to be the most likely explanation, at least to me. And that is that the drones that Strike Eagle pilots saw were not Iranian or even operated by Iran, and were actually, as yet undisclosed, drone-based tools operated by the United States, or maybe Israel. Now, if that strikes you as a surprise, let's talk about why. As we've discussed on this channel time and time again, the American media is increasingly designed not to inform the public, but rather to evoke strong enough emotional reactions to drive the clicks, the shares, and the comments that directly translate into both reach and revenue. And that reminds me, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment. Now, that push for reach and revenue often manifests in headlines that omit context, lean into sensationalism and hyperbole, and prey on popular misconceptions. It isn't accidental that news outlets continue to misrepresent ballistic missiles as modern hypersonic weapons. It's because hypersonic is a buzzword that you can hang a headline on. It isn't unintentional that low F-35 readiness rates are reported without the context that would tell you the Air Force's F-35 fleet often has higher readiness rates than any of the other fighters in the American stable. It isn't unplanned when cheap prop-driven cruise missiles operated by geopolitical boogeymen are renamed kamikaze drones for scary effect, or when America's defense spending is compared to China's claimed military figures rather than what experts contend they actually spend. And there's also a reason Europeans visiting the US for the World Cup are shocked to learn that this country isn't actually a dystopian Wild West hellscape. Likewise, it is not incidental that most mainstream media would have you believe that the United States is focused solely on fielding pricey new fighter jets instead of drones, as though the richest nation in the history of our planet, populated by nearly 350 million people, can't seem to focus on more than one thing at a time. In 2027, America's defense budget will exceed the entire gross domestic product of all but 18 nations on Earth. Uncle Sam doesn't have to find his battlefield tech in the bargain bin just to be able to field it in volume. In terms of equivalent buying power, the US can afford to spend well over $6,000 for every 500 spent by a nation like Russia. And that isn't to say that the US doesn't have lots of room for improvement in its broad pursuit of new drone capabilities, but it would be a mistake to assume America's investments into new fighter jets, bombers, and warships are coming instead of investments in drones just because you don't see headlines about it. In reality, those investments are coming in parallel to drone efforts. The US Army alone has ramped up investments into small drone technologies from around $40.7 million in 2021 to just shy of $128 million in 2025. And of course, that's before we consider drone programs that draw their funding from America's black budget, as it's often called, but it's actually the common name for the combined funding allotted to the National Intelligence Program, or NIP, and the Military Intelligence Program, or MIP, which in 2025 totaled more than $101 billion. Now that is enough classified funding to buy 1,000 F-35s a year, or to fund some pretty interesting secret drone projects. And I've taken you with me on this drone rant for a reason, because one of my theories tying the drone formations reported over rural Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas in December of 2019 through January of 2020 to the drone formations spotted over Langley, Virginia in December of 2023 was a firm covertly developing and testing new drone capabilities over parts of the United States, followed by securing a classified government contract and the same or similar systems being employed for red teaming against American military installations like Langley Air Force Base. Now, the Pentagon's 2003 report entitled The Role and Status of DoD Red Teaming Activities explained that red teams play the role of adversary forces and are sometimes tasked with emulating the known capabilities and tactics of an adversary. But in other instances, these teams may be given, quote, wider latitudes to discover technological counters to U.S. systems. In other words, red teams aren't always just substitutes for Russia or China, and at times they can get really creative with the ways they go about circumventing American defenses. In the 1980s alone, as one infamous example, SEAL Team 6 founder Dick Marchenko's team, dubbed Red Cell, reportedly infiltrated U.S. installations, stole top-secret documents, kidnapped civilian security personnel, and even allegedly planted a fake bomb near Air Force One. Red team activities are obviously not always disclosed to the public, especially when they're leveraging classified technologies. So, hypothetically speaking, if a company tested its combined drone swarm autonomy suite over the American heartland in 2019 and 2020, then saw new iterations of that same tech employed in red teaming operations over Virginia in 2023, it seems pretty feasible to me that that same hardware could have made the leap to covert operational use by 2026. And this idea isn't exactly without precedent. In 2017, DARPA kicked off their Offensive Swarm-Enabled Tactics, or Offset program, which aimed to give infantry troops swarms of up to 250 drones of different types for a variety of mission sets. And that program culminated in a 2021 exercise that saw Hive XL drone carrier units launching and recovering swarming drones that flew in coordination with larger fixed-wing drones in a swarm that ultimately included more than 300 drone platforms, ranging from off-the-shelf systems to much larger military assets. The year prior, DARPA's X-61 Gremlins, low-cost UAVs, demonstrated their ability to be launched and recovered from a large mothership cargo aircraft mid-flight. And in 2023, SOCOM announced its intentions to field drone dispensers on MQ-9 Reapers to have them operate as long-endurance drone motherships. Again, these are just the programs that are publicly disclosed, and that isn't even an exhaustive list. And that brings us back around to Operation Epic Fury and the efforts to locate, identify, and destroy hidden Iranian military assets like ballistic missile launchers. Now, Iran is not a small nation. You could very nearly fit 3 Ukraines inside it. And with 47 years to spend tucking hardware away within some 233,000 square miles of territory, hunting for these systems represents an incredible challenge in terms of geography alone. let alone the risk to aircraft like that downed Strike Eagle or the F-35 that also ate a missile from a manpad. In a lot of ways, Iran is an environment that is perfectly suited for swarming drone sensors that are digitally tethered to a larger platform that's serving as a communications and navigation node, which can hunt for those weapons without risking human life. And while I can't tell you what that pilot actually saw, I can tell you where I would place my bet. Again, if I were into that sort of thing. If this jellyfish drone swarm was really operating in the skies over Iran, I doubt it was Iranian, or even Iranian operated. With the US and Israel both scouring the Iranian landscape for military hardware at the time, I think it's more likely that the pilot saw undisclosed drone-based tools operated by American or Israeli forces that he just wasn't aware of. But that's just a theory, a defense theory. And to be honest, I'm not even convinced that I totally buy this report in the first place, at least based on the little bit of evidence that's surfaced so far. If more evidence surfaces, I'll certainly revisit that position. So how about you? Do you think our Strike Eagle pilot really saw what these reports claim? And if you do, what do you think they were? Sound off in the comments below and let me know. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day, or better yet, just download the entirely free Sandboxx News app, which includes all of our great written content and all of our long and short form videos. And I just learned yesterday that our Android version will be dropping very soon. I promise you guys, I know I've been saying it's coming. It is finally coming. Please bear with me. And if you got anything out of this video, please make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.